Today, I have a really exciting video to share with you guys that went live on March 29th in the morning. It was Palantir's first ever live AMA, or Ask Me Anything, with their chief architect Akshay. Now, the first portion showcases a new video breaking down the value of the Foundry platform, and the final part is where Akshay comes onto the screen to answer questions. And mind you, this was a live video that was hosted through LinkedIn, which definitely doesn't have the best platform for live streaming. So for the countless portions of the video that start to freeze or stutter, that is not YouTube, but rather the limitations of LinkedIn's video and how it was recorded. So apologies in advance. If you find yourself at a frozen or stuttering frame, simply hit the right arrow key on your computer to skip forward 5 seconds, or hit the L key to skip forward 10 seconds. Anyway, if you're currently invested in Palantir, I think you'll find a lot of gold nuggets in this video and some great takeaways. So with that said, kick back, relax, and enjoy.
Hey everybody, my name is Akshay Krishnaswamy and I'm the Chief Architect for Palantir's commercial business. I'm excited to talk to you guys today about the Foundry platform. Just one note on who Palantir is for folks who might not know. We were founded in 2003 with the mission of building data-driven operations and decision-making software. We got our start in intelligence and defense, kind of working across national security contexts, and a lot of how we think about our software was informed by the kind of learnings in those frontline deployment settings. Today, we work across a lot of different industries, 40 plus industries, a lot of places outside of government, and across the commercial sector, in the nonprofit sector, and all parts of the government now as well. We have 3 software platforms at Palantir that we think of as operating systems. Gotham is our defense. Apollo is our operating system for deploying and managing complex software footprints across many different environments. And Foundry, which is what we're going to talk about today, is what we think of as our operating system for the modern enterprise. If we think about the modern digital landscape, we recognize that most organizations are already on a journey, right? They're setting up data lakes, data warehouses, they're deploying many different types of analytics solutions. And in fact, we're partners with a lot of the folks that you might think of out there in the industry. I think what we tend to see is that those technologies come together in a very classical reference architecture, right? You have different data sources coming in as being loaded into different data platforms, data lakes, data warehouses. That data then undergoes different types of transformation. It's then prepared for analytics and typically then deployed into BI applications or reporting. You can kind of think about this as a linear flow or an assembly line of data, where you have producers on one end kind of responsible for putting the data together and then producing the data products, which are then consumed by different types of business users through reports or dashboards. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with reports or dashboards, it does leave a lot on the table when it comes to, well, how do I benefit from people learning what to do when they actually see that data? How do I understand what actions to take as a consequence of presenting that data to business users? And how do we actually engineer a feedback loop between people on the front lines and people in the back office actually doing data and analytics work? You sort of see data coming together in reports or dashboards. You might notice an insight, but then as a business user or an operational user, you just kind of pivot away to the next thing you have to do. And we think that while this is kind of sufficient, this model, this assembly line for reporting and for dashboards, most organizations that we talk to feel the need to go beyond this model, just given the complexity in the world. And so you're kind of limited by this producer-consumer paradigm. And I think, if we think about what's happening in the world today, kind of both in terms of exogenous shocks out there in the world, the complexities inside organizations' 4 walls with their partners, just having this assembly line approach isn't sufficient for dealing with that complexity. And so what we see kind of over and over again is that folks want to be able to use kind of the exhaust, the learnings, the feedback from people interacting with data and models to better inform their processes. They want to, kind of consider those learnings not exhaust, but fuel for the business. And so we think about, well, how do we kind of turn this typical producer-consumer paradigm on its head and actually kind of have a different modality where there are data kind of producers and consumers in every part of the business working together in a common platform. So we think about Foundry as providing an open architecture for closing the loop between operations and analytics. It provides the ability to bring your existing data and model tooling together inside of an ontology which you can then use to build workflows, applications, and actually capture decisions with to inform better operations over time and continuous learning. With Foundry, we kind of say to everybody in the enterprise, to data teams, bring your data lakes, bring your data warehouses, bring kind of all the data that exists across different systems and connect that into Foundry as sort of what we think of as the nouns of the enterprise, right? The semantics. And to the analytics teams, we say the same thing. Bring the models, bring the linear programming models, the ML models, the stored procedures, and allow those to be connected into the same foundation as sort of the verbs that go along with the nouns that give you kind of all the business processes. Kind of assemble this operating layer iteratively over time through use cases. You then build out a very powerful foundation to do many things. You can drive more and more kind of operational workflows that are read-write, where business users are contributing their knowledge back into the foundation. You can do kind of more sophisticated analytics, like running scenarios and what-if analysis. And critically, you can capture decisions and pipe those to all sorts of different enterprise systems, both new and old. So again, we think by closing the loop, it's a very different architecture than kind of the one-way assembly line of data. In terms of how it works, Foundry comes with everything you need from top to bottom to implement complex operational workflows. This includes data integration, model integration, an ontology layer that encompasses objects and relationships and actions and business processes, an entire workflow layer that includes application building, self-serve analytics, and more, and a decision orchestration layer that's designed to capture learnings from end users and those back to analytics and data teams and other business systems. And so for fresh architectures, we think Foundry can get folks operational in days. But we also understand that most organizations have made investments in existing data and analytics tools. And so Foundry's modular architecture allows you to bring your own data platforms, data lakes, data warehouses, analytics tools, ML services, and plug those into Foundry's data integration and model integration layers, and extend them up into the ontology and into operational workflows. And so Foundry is designed to work in heterogeneous, complex architectures that are changing over time, all the time. One of the most common integration patterns we get asked about is, how does Foundry work with my existing data platforms? My Snowflake, my GCP, my Azure, my AWS data warehouse. That is purely extending those platforms into operations, where Foundry will never fracture the source of truth that exists in those data platforms, and instead will marry them up with different analytics tools and business processes to build the ontology in a way that respects the governance policies in place in those analytics and data tools. And so you can think about this as setting retention policies, security policies, bidirectional data syncs that will ensure that Foundry is always in sync with those existing data systems. As organizations evolve, we expect they're going to continue to invest in new data tools, new analytics tools, new governance tools, and it can be a great citizen in a landscape that's only going to get more and more complex over time. As underlying data and analytics architectures continue to evolve, Foundry is designed to serve as a resilient, stable operating layer that can continuously benefit from different systems coming online and allow different user groups to make better decisions over time using the ontology-driven approach. So in summary, Foundry is designed to deeply integrate with existing architectures, data platforms, data lakes, data warehouses, and all manner of analytics solutions as well, integrating both data and analytics primitives into an operating layer that can be used to power feedback-driven workflows across the entire business. You can get started today with a single workflow in Foundry. But the power of Foundry is really in the compounding that occurs when you scale from a single workflow to enterprise use cases. We're excited to see what you're going to be able to do with Foundry. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. I apologize for that video being so stuttery. We're going to figure out what was going on there, but want to make sure that we can budget enough time here to make sure that we can answer questions, restate what's there, and also want to clarify that video will be available on our channel as well, and on kind of other social media and website portals as well. So very excited to talk with people today. Just by way of introduction, I am Akshay Krishnaswamy. I'm the Chief Architect here at Palantir. And yeah, I think without further ado, we'd just love to dive into questions you guys have about Palantir, about Foundry, and kind of anything else that's on folks' mind as well. We're hoping to make this more of a regular occurrence. And again, we're sort of at our most natural state when we can just talk with folks and answer questions in longer form. So expect that we'll have more of these without sort of video front loads in the future too. So cool. Maybe we just jump into it then. All right. So I think we have a first question here which is how do we think about Foundry being like, do we think about Foundry as a data platform, or do we think about Foundry as something other than a data platform? And I think that's a great question. And that's a question that we get very often. And I'd say like the way that we think about Foundry is it encompasses what you might think of as being included in a data platform. So things like data connectivity to different sources, structured sources, unstructured sources, IoT sources, geospatial sources, and kind of the whole journey of taking data from different systems, being able to synchronize with it, secure it, version it, put health checks on it, and also create sort of robust data pipelines at scale. And we've built, we think, a lot of infrastructure there that allows us to do this quickly. But we think that's just part of the journey, right? So ultimately, we think that kind of what's contained in the data platform, or what's kind of in data ops, kind of what you think of normatively, has to be kind of brought into a broader kind of scaffolding with model ops. So the same kind of story for model integration, model development, kind of being able to do the whole ML ops lifecycle, and also kind of operational workflows and application building for end users and folks who are not technical. And so we think about it as an operations platform or an operating system, whichever you prefer, that does include data elements, of course, and is very data centric. But we don't try to think about it as a data platform, because ultimately we think it's the interplay of those three different types of dynamics that actually makes Foundry stand apart in kind of the architectures in which it is deployed. Cool. I think there's a question here, which is great, which just came in, which is, can we talk about how Palantir streamlines the data integration process? Also a great question, a very common question too. So this is something that I think we have kind of an interesting perspective on, because the Pebble was really in our shoe from the very early days, working with our first customers in defense and intelligence about, how do we actually nuts and bolts make data integration smoother for people who are on the front lines doing mission critical work. And there's kind of the theoretical aspect of how you think about data integration, getting, by some quantitative metric better, or, hitting better KPIs over time. Then there's the reality of, is this actually making a difference to somebody who it has to make a difference for in the field, or on, in a factory setting, or wherever it might be. And so we've thought a lot about kind of operations backwards. What are the things you need to streamline data integration? And, a couple things that I think I'll highlight here, which we can, of course, go in depth on in follow-on sessions, are, for systems that we've seen over and over again as an organization, as Palantir, how can we basically understand the ways to progressively automate the integration from those systems? So for those of you that have seen our hyper auto presentations and the content out there, that's our sort of what I think of as our skeptical kind of one step at a time attempt to get automation to a point where we can trust it for operations. So it's not just saying, hey, we're going to do a simple sort of, schema transposition, or some sort of, simple kind of, kind of like what I call is like a heuristic way of kind of doing data integration from these complex ERPs, which are often very customized for customers. But can we actually write the proper native integrations with those systems that do dynamic inference across not just sort of the standard modules, but custom libraries as well? So you can actually say in an afternoon or in a couple of days, I could integrate a complex ERP estate, which might be 26 ERPs under the hood. It might be one giant ERP under the hood. It might be several vendors under the hood. And so we think about streamlining it from that perspective through HyperAuto with just speed to value, and where that output is not just another set of golden tables, but is an ontology you can actually use to drive business process and workflows with as well. So I think that's one aspect, right? Which is, how does the HyperAuto framework help us really get to value faster? And we're trying to, again, expand that in a judicious but efficient and fast manner to all types of systems that people are working with in different domains, where we think that intelligence can be useful. The other things I'll add in here, kind of at the data integration layer, include being able to build in kind of all the things that we wanted as engineers, kind of as a wish list, sort of in that integration layer of the platform. So things like, I don't want to have to go to a different tool to do data quality checks and monitor data health. Can I actually have that right on top of the data itself in the platform, taking advantage of the distributed compute engine, so I can actually do full cardinality checks? Is something late? is the cardinality of these values wrong? Even more sophisticated checks that can integrate with external systems on whether or not I should allow these pipelines to refresh or not. So data health is a big component here. And then I think another thing which we think of as sort of unlocking collaboration generally is having a really robust security framework, right? So you can never really do that much with data integration at scale if you're always limited or concerned about whether or not it's secure, right, fundamentally. And so we've tried to build the right primitives and assumptions into the platform that allow you to go fast, but do so safely. And you can say the entitlements or the security sort of permissions that I've put in place, whether those are role-based access controls, classification-based access controls, purpose-based access controls, will actually by default do this secure, insane thing of actually kind of percolating with the data, with the models, with the workflows. And so that's built into the data integration layer, which then empowers, again, folks to actually collaborate in ways that we think is very different than in systems where you're just kind of locking down kind of a subdirectory or some sort of set of tables. So there's a lot more I could go into, but we think a lot about kind of the feature set in that part of the platform, the data integration part, as what gets us to operations and value as fast as possible and gets us to meaningful outcomes as fast as possible. And I think one thing we can talk about later is, it's very feedback driven. So how are end users telling you whether or not the data actually is in good shape or not, right? You might think it's great from the data engineering side forward, but you might understand from an end user it's actually missing the mark. And so how are they empowered to give you feedback and to actually give you sort of requests or kind of granular guidance on how they want to adjust the pipelines over time to make things better? Cool. Let me just look at the next question here. Okay. So I think that one question just right after this one, kind of going in sequence, is, do we think about Foundry as a no-code, low-code platform? I think this is a great question too, because I think this is kind of a complementary question to what was asked earlier, which is, if we think about, is Foundry a data platform, right? We said, well, no, we think about it kind of as an operations platform, right? Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it has to encompass data ops, model ops, and operational workflows and application building. And so in that operational workflow and application building kind of sphere of things, there's absolutely no code and low code tooling in there. I think where our skepticism comes into place is if people are stuck with that being the only option. And I think there is sort of a connotation out there in the market today, right? Where, okay, if it's no code or low code, it means a couple of things instinctively to me as somebody who's a technologist, right? It means, okay, it allows people to go fast, but then they're stuck in some proprietary framework and that's not good. And also it's maybe like, low floor, but it's also low ceiling, right? That's kind of the conventional way people think about low code or no code, where we've tried to say, okay, how can we make sure it's powerful, but it's an option among other options if you want to build in Foundry, right? So we have a set of different frameworks for application building that I'd say kind of run the gamut from low code to or no code to low code to pro code, where, depending on what you're comfortable with and what the kind of scope is, you can use any of those application builders. And we want people to have that full range of options, including with tools that do not live in Foundry, right? So you want to connect via the APIs to the data and the models you've integrated into the ontology and build something using your own React frameworks or using some other, set of kind of front-end libraries that you prefer in your own cloud environments that are connected in with Foundry. And so while we do offer things in the low code and no code space, and we think there's a lot of power that we can offer there because we can tap into kind of all of the conventions that are baked into the ontology, it is just one option among many for building. And we kind of philosophically think that's the way to success because there, it makes sense for certain settings and less sense for others. Cool. Let me just look at some of the other questions here. Yeah, so I think one question we get all the time is someone said, how does Foundry integrate with platforms like Databricks and others out there, which is a great question too. And I think this is part of, we'll make sure to make that video available that we were trying to hit on in the video, is saying we're going to assume that most customers that we work with are going to be using a lot of different technologies in the data integration space, in the model integration space over time, right? And there's great technologies today. There will be great technologies tomorrow as well. And what we've tried to design fundamentally when it comes to the data integration journey in Foundry and the model integration journey is flexibility and interoperability and a commitment to open standards. And so what that means is if you think about the way the data transformation is done in Foundry, for instance, just using, the compute framework that's in Foundry, we're using, out of the box, just solely open source runtime. So we're using Spark and Flink running on top of Kubernetes. You can actually bring your own other engines as well. And we're using languages that have bindings to those open runtimes. So we're using Python, Java, SQL, You can even use Groovy or Scala if you want as well, and mix and match these different kind of languages on top of those open runtimes. And so if we think about, and we're also by default, the data that's being stored, in the data sets in Foundry is using Parquet or using some sort of, industry standard format that again is also an open standard. And so if people say, hey, we are doing some of the data transformation work in Databricks or in, EMR or in other tools already, it's like, awesome. It's like you can, there's a couple options there for how you want to integrate that with Foundry, right? There is both the option of saying, I've done some of the integration work there and I then want to pick up where I left off in Foundry and keep going, which should work pretty seamlessly, again, because we're all using Spark and the related ecosystem under the hood for at least that Databricks example. Could look very different for other types of transformation modalities, say in geospatial or IoT data, but talking about Databricks. You could also have, basically a ability to connect in from Databricks to Foundry and say, I want to read data from Foundry, do transformation, then push it back. Like, again, the way that you can interact in a pull and push manner is actually, quite straightforward, again, because we're working with the same kind of core primitives on both sides. And so, we always sort of say, hey, if people like using those sorts of tools, whether it's for transformation or it's for model ops, that's awesome, because like those are inputs into the ontology, and those are ways that we can then help people get to value faster through the workflows they deploy with Foundry. And we think it is actually a competitive advantage for us, and we've thought about it that way to interoperate as extensively as possible with those parts of the tool set. So, great. Just looking at some other questions here. Yeah, there's a good question here about data integration, data ingestion capabilities, the ontology, and combining in multiple CRMs. So I think this is a great question, and I think it touches on a few of the things we've been talking about so far, which is, if we think about the value proposition here of being able to move from the different domain models you might have in different systems, right? So you have one domain model or one set of schemas for the CRM, one for the ERP, one for the MES, and many other systems. And in this case, maybe one for each CRM that you're working with. And you want to basically say, I want to be able to get to an ontology that combines multiple CRMs. Well, I think as we all know here, like the integrate, so the HyperAuto framework is being expanded to be able to do this reconciliation work across many common types of CRMs. So I'd say like it's very quickly becoming the same sort of turnkey solution that we've talked about with ERP systems as well. But today, there's a lot of leverage and a lot of out-of-the-box sort of templates that we as Palantir can provide our customers and the technical teams in those customers to get going very fast when it comes to CRM reconciliation, right? When you think about kind of the core ontology elements in the CRM, right? So the customers, the accounts, the opportunities that you might find in, systems like Salesforce or Dynamics or others. That's a pretty well-worn path in terms of how we might get started with a first archetype or first template that gets you from raw data to first ontology and even first use case. And so once you get there, the organization has a lot of options, right? You can, of course, carry out all types of different workflows that kind of span, kind of nuts and bolts, kind of like customer triage, all the way up to being able to run scenarios, assemble new cohorts, actually assemble new strategies on a more granular basis. So effectively over time, Foundry can become a bit of, I think what I've heard someone calls like a hyper CRM, or a bit of a layer that sits on top. It can also just as easily be used to make decisions kind of as the kind of operational cockpit, and then push those decisions back to the existing CRM systems. And we've seen both patterns over time, where customers say, as I progressively use Foundry, I want to effectively make it run more and more of those kind of workflow-based operations instead of doing that in the CRM. We've also seen people say, hey, Foundry is really the synthesis layer, where we're actually kind of running all the different workflows, and then we want to use the decision orchestration part of Foundry to get those different data elements back to the CRMs, because it's important to have those systems still up to date for lots of different reasons. And so I think it's a great question, and we see both patterns kind of over time. Cool. I think there's a question here about, is Foundry recommended for companies with a modern data platform like cloud data lakes? What is the ideal data environment in which Foundry works best? Take a sip of water here, and then I'll answer that question. That's a great question. I think the answer is emphatically yes. So I think, if we think about what customers are doing right now, oftentimes in the cloud transformation journey, right? It is kind of what we think of as, I think what most people here might be familiar with, which is I've moved from my on-prem, data warehouses or data lakes to really good cloud platforms. So I've taken care of storage. I have some compute happening. Maybe I have some data governance tools in place now, but like the consolidation activity is underway or is even quite mature at this point in those data platforms. But the question is then, how do I go beyond that and actually start to build operational capability? Right. So, if we think about kind of what the ERP was to the relational database, where it extended kind of just data storage into workflows and operations, we think the same thing has to be true kind of in this new world as well, right? Where you've done the data platform thing and maybe you have some BI or dashboards happening on top of it too, which is great. But it's like, now how do I actually build workflows that span analytics and operations to actually deliver impact for the business? And so the way that we think about it is, if you have basically still a vast collection of data sources in different places, which is a lot of people we talk to, we have the tooling in Foundry to be able to integrate that data together and then get to the operational piece. But if you've already succeeded or are on the journey of doing that data consolidation piece itself, that's great too, because we can say, okay, now we have the data inputs, we'll get the analytics inputs as well, or you'll do that in Foundry. And then we're going to, again, the whole sort of reason for being is to then be able to power different types of workflows and operations across different parts of the business. And so, I think oftentimes when we actually say, hey, the layers below, the data platform layer can and should exist, and we can do that in Foundry. You can do that with other tools as well. But ultimately, the value that's pulling this forward is in kind of the frontline parts of the business. And I think once we show that, demo that, we're trying to do a better job of enunciating that. I think people tend to see it's very much an and proposition, not an or proposition. Let's just scroll through here and see a couple other questions that folks have. Cool. I think there's a couple kind of just like very, very kind of basic questions here, which are important to hit on, which is, okay, if I use Foundry, if I use any Palantir software, who controls the data? How does that work? And I think that's a really important question to just hit like sort of straight on, which is Palantir is not in the business of brokering data, owning customer data, any of that stuff. A customer's data is always the customer's data. We build and supply software, in the same way that other software providers do. And all of the IP, all of the work, all of the data, the models, the logic, the metadata belong exclusively to the customer. And what they choose to do with that is strictly under their control, right? And that includes being able to say, hey, they want to build a asset in Foundry that they then make accessible, perhaps, to their partners securely within their own guidance, like Airbus has done with Skywise. Or they want to, potentially monetize that data asset because they have plans for building a new business unit around what they've built in Foundry. Again, totally at the discretion of the organization using the Foundry platform. So everything that we've built from an infrastructure perspective is designed to maximally comply with customers' regulatory paradigms and security requirements, to the point that we think it's a real strength for us in terms of being able to meet customers who are working in sensitive environments and oftentimes have very, complex, heterogeneous requirements from different parts of the organization. So as an example, we can of course deploy Foundry as, a default kind of SaaS offering, which is the most common offering that we see across the board in the commercial space. But that isn't always going to work for every customer in every environment, right? So we have, thanks to our Apollo platform, which sits behind Foundry and does the continuous delivery, we have the ability to deploy Foundry in many different configurations. And that includes, as an extension to customers' existing clouds, on premises, in hybrid cloud environments, and even not just in classified networks, but also across disconnected environments as well. And so in all of those cases, Foundry is meshing with an existing customer's existing infrastructure or their existing policies and firmly under their control when it comes to data, logic, and all IP. So just want to make that totally clear. Cool. Let's take a look at one last question here, which is, can you talk about model ops for data scientists? Do you support R or RStudio, and how would Foundry make the life of a data scientist easier? Yeah, this is an awesome question. And so I think it's kind of very analogous to how we think about the data integration piece that we talked about so far, where people often say like, oh, do I have to just do everything in Foundry? Or like, is this the only, like, is it basically a rip and replace if I want to go here? Very much not the case, right? So I think the first thing that we've tried to think about is, the joke that I have internally is, if you ask people at Palantir what data science tooling they like to use, like our data scientists or our forward deployed engineers, if you ask 5 people, you'll get 10 answers, right? People love to use Data IQ, Data Robot, SageMaker, Azure ML, Vertex AI. Like there's a lot of great tools out there, right? And so we've tried to be very specific about where can we add value in a very kind of growing organic landscape. And we think about it in two ways, right? The first is we want to provide clean, consistent access to data that's governed and that's semantic to those model builders, right? So, we don't want data scientists spending we didn't like spending 80% of our time having to munch through data as we built models, right? So how can we provide clean, consistent hooks into the ontology so you can build features, train your models, and do that from any environment that you want to, right? Using APIs, using SDKs, using direct secure file system access if that's what you need. And so we provide like a code workbook environment, which is effectively a Jupyter style, notebook style environment for building out models end-to-end in Foundry as well. And you can use that. Great. You can also choose to connect any of your other tools to the data in Foundry and use those as well. And many people prefer to do that. And so the data access point and being able to securely kind of be able to tap into the power of the ontology is the first thing that we think is interesting from a data science enablement perspective, right? In addition to kind of all of the model building, model ops stuff you could do in Foundry, analogous to what you can do in other systems as well. The second thing that we think is more interesting and just as important as sort of data access and data quality is what is the path to production for models, right? I've built a model somewhere else. It's great. If I built it in Foundry, I'm excited to use it. How do I now deploy it directly into an operational application and start to actually get into a feedback loop, me as the data scientist with operational users? And we think like that's the chasm that's really hard to cross, right? Because there's so many different dimensions to doing that. Where if you think about like, okay, what data did I train my model on? Who signed off on the model? How do I actually inject that model into the application? What's the sort of mechanism for getting feedback on the model recommendations that might be appearing to a user in an application? How does the application builder know how to insert that into the application they've built? It's a really high bar. And I think people who have done this know it's very complicated. And so we've tried to really say that, through what we call as the model objectives framework in Foundry, or the mission objectives framework, you can think about effectively having this whole promotion process that goes from competing potentially dozens of different models from different providers built in different places or more against a given objective, choosing a model that will then win, sort of like gladiator style. And then you say, and this can happen through automation or through manual curation, and then allowing the model that you want to actually insert into workflows have a binding to the ontology. So it's almost like a type system for models where you say, I'm now going to consistently call this model with certain inputs from the ontology in Foundry. And then in a parameterized way, those the return values from the model will also enrich the ontology. And you're kind of doing this sort of like binding between models and operational layer, which means that if you then want to insert those models into different applications or workflows throughout Foundry, using the low code, the pro code, the no code application builders, or things you're building through the APIs, there's a very consistent way to do that. And so, and as people give you feedback, it's collected. If models are promoted, people who are downstream of that will be aware of the fact that the model has changed. It's building the connective tissue between the model builders and the operational folks and the data folks as well that we think is really powerful in Foundry. And we think that's very complementary to all the tools out there, which is why we're partners with folks like the AWS SageMakers, the Data Robots, and others out there.